A very good afternoon, everyone, and welcome at this lecture about looted art by Dr. Naomi Oosterman. My name is Lenja Slierendrecht and I work as a program maker for Studium Generale, and we organize lectures like today, but also open stage nights, movie nights, and we also do a talk show. If you want to know more about our events, you can follow us on Instagram through SG Erasmus and on our webpage through EUR SG Erasmus. But today we are gathered here for a lecture on contested heritage and looted art. Many museums and governments struggle with it. What some consider as a museum masterpiece might for others be an important part of their identity of an individual or a community, or even an ancestor. Should the original owner or community be found and the object be repatriated? Or is it in some cases better if it remains in a museum? How did museums acquire these works? And where and who were the people who illicitly trade in art, heritage and human remains? Dr. Naomi Oosterman is an assistant professor at Cultural Heritage at Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication, and she researches illicit trade in cultural goods with a specific focus on Latin America. She also deals with issues of colonial heritage and decolonization. Give her a warm hand of applause, Dr. Naomi Oosterman.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is on. As Lenja already said, I am Naomi Oosterman and I study the illicit trade in cultural objects. What that in reality means is I study stuff like looting, trafficking, theft, but also cases in how they are policed and how they are enforced. And at the same time I try to apply at least a critical heritage perspective to my work and therefore talk about things like contested heritage and decolonization. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is a mix of all these things together actually. And to present to you an overview of what is looted art, what is colonial and post-colonial looting and trafficking of cultural objects, what are some of the legal and heritage perspectives around it, and how does a concept like decolonization even fit in here? And does it fit in here? And initially, my idea was to bring you on a specific case, like on a journey with a specific case. But then I thought, this topic suffers rather from sensationalist narratives, romanticized narratives. Sometimes it also, it has become recently pretty much the discussion of a very polarized debate. Discussions on colonialism and colonial loot are part of a very heated debate nowadays. So instead of going into an in-depth case that might not really be representative of the broader thing or the broader context that is the illicit trade, I want to give you a more general, but at the same time a more nuanced perspective of the history of, and then also the contemporary implications that looted art has. And in that sense, I want to, with this presentation, also stay a bit closer to the people that this actually concerns. But before I start, just a few disclaimers that are necessary to not get slapped, which is an actual term that doesn't mean slapped, it means that you get a litigation. Not all pictures that are displayed in this presentation are necessarily objects that are looted. Some are looted and returned. Some could be questionable, but a lot of pictures and images are also simply illustrations of types of objects that could be particularly prone to looting and heritage. So please don't assume that everything on this slide is then also immediately looted or a problem. I rely on an absolute ton of specialists, not just me. I talk about my own research, but I also use research from obviously academics, but also grassroots organizations, investigative journalists. At the end, there's my big disclaimer and woohoo slide of who all these people are. And at the same time, I can also not address everything. This is a massive topic. Just bear with me. I'm going to have to give you a bird's eye perspective and allow myself some freedoms in what I'm actually going to talk to you about. So, without further ado, when preparing this presentation, I have to say this was maybe one of the hardest slides to actually make, because categories of looted art can be very diverse. However, if we want to provide a broad definition of what looted art is, we can say that this is art that is either unlawfully obtained or illicitly acquired. Now, some examples here, actually, on the slides, are the Canon of Kandy. Some of you might remember this. It was taken as loot during the Dutch presence in Sri Lanka in the 18th century and was exhibited for a long time in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam before it was actually returned. Or Benin bronzes, as you see an example of on the bottom left slide, of which many were looted in the 19th century from the Kingdom of Benin and are scattered throughout Europe and are, of course, as maybe some of you know because you're interested in this, now topic of larger restitution debates and return debates that go throughout Europe. But we also have the category of Nazi loot, which might also be something that you are already aware of. On the bottom right, we see Adolf Hitler inspecting a painting, and the self-portrait of Rembrandt on the top right, which I believe is on display at the Mauritshuis, was also actually recovered as Nazi loot in a salt mine in Austria. So as you can see, there's a lot of categories of what looted art can be. So we can talk about colonial loot, Nazi loot, looting during times of armed conflict and war. But of course, we also, and I also talk about looting and trafficking in neo-colonial contexts. So also today. And maybe from a context in which there is not war or no conflict or no instability. And today I am mostly going to focus on the latter. First and the latter. So colonial looting and contemporary looting and trafficking. So starting off with colonial loot, and I'm going to start in the 16th and 17th century. There was looting and trade before that, but like I said, I cannot start well before, so I am going to start with the time of colonial expansion drifts, predominantly from European countries such as Spain, England, the Netherlands, France, and during these colonial regimes, undoubtedly you know this, next to exploitation, displacement, enslavement, also the looting and plunder of what we call cultural and ethnological objects took place. These objects were then often taken back to home countries in the European continent. Now, some of these objects, they ended up being displayed in what were called cabinets of curiosity. And some of them, these are examples of how these could actually look like. These cabinets of curiosity, they were often large collections of objects from colonies, and they were collected, amongst other reasons, to show the exoticism of overseas colonial lands, but also the savagery of overseas lands, and to demonstrate the superiority of Europeans and the white race. This did not limit itself to these, again, I'm going to do a lot of this, but cultural objects and ethnological objects. It also concerned flora, fauna, fossils, minerals, and unfortunately also living people. And note that, however, apart from living people, many of these objects were also taken by individuals, administrators, for example, of colonial regimes, and that trade between local peoples and colonizers also took place. Now, these practices continued well into the 18th century, and in that time, and in the very early 19th century, we see the shift to what we know nowadays and what we recognize as being museums. Like these example. And like I said, I am taking a massive time leap, but museums like the Louvre, the British Museum, the Rijksmuseum, they were established, amongst other reasons, to serve as symbols for the unification and for the strengthening of national identity. So in this time, we start talking about this idea of national museums, national collections. And of course, as you can imagine, these collections then also consisted of objects that were taken from the colonies. At the same time, they also centered a lot around the classics. Now, these museums often bought or acquired from private individuals, the collections of private individuals. For example, the British Museum, right, in our field known as the gift that keeps on giving, bought from Thomas Bruce. Who is Thomas Bruce? Does anyone know? Does anyone know when I say Elgin? That rings a bell? Yeah, now we know. Also known as the Earl or the Lord of Elgin, sold the Parthenon Marbles in the early, the computer is freaking, in the early 19th century. So at this moment in time, this is also when we saw this idea of the universality of museums, this universality of collections, And actually the idea of universal importance became more rooted and more prevalent. So that it is sort of good for all, or important to all. But who those all were of course, yeah, there was unbalance in power there was inequality in there. Now these cabinets of curiosity, they also transformed into what we know now as ethnographic or ethnological museums. And the collections in these specific museums were also often bought, for example, from administrators that were based in former colonies, or in the colonies at that time. They amassed collections, people living in colonies at the time through trade, or were gifted or donated to the appointment of former administrators as curators. So former administrators also became, for example, curators of these museums. This in no way meant that this stopped, that the taking of objects then stopped because now the museums had enough. That's not the case. It continued well into the 19th century, well into the 20th century, until actually today. And one thing that I should note here, and I've been doing a lot of this, which I'm going to be doing a lot during this presentation, is that we also should think critically about the words looted art. Maybe we think that it's unproblematic to say looted art, but actually when we talk about art, and you can see a lot of terms here, when we talk about these types of objects, they represent much more than, let's say, a painting, maybe simply, again, air quotes, simply a painting by Rembrandt. And what we might consider to be art in terms of cultural objects or heritage objects, because we see it in a museum, right? And museums show art, and ergo, therefore, this is art for us. It might never have been intended as art, or it might not have been considered to be art in the first place, or at least not art as we understand it. And with we, I mean in the sort of European/Western context. And at the same time, some of these categorizations have become so common practice, like pre-Columbian art, which emphasize at the same time some sort of homogenization of indigenous cultures before Columbus came to the Americas, which creates an idea that everything that happened before that in terms of cultural expression or culture can be just seen as this one thing, while at the same time in the actual word of itself focusing on the person who went there. At the same time, cultural heritage effectively, or we can define cultural heritage as the physical manifestation of the identity of a group or a community. So, or an individual, of course. So when we are talking about looted art or cultural objects or cultural goods, we need to also be careful and think about where these terminologies actually come from, what they signify, how they are used in different contexts, and what connotations they have. And that means what implicit feelings do we get from using these words? What do they mean for us? Later I will definitely tell you more about this, but know that when I say cultural objects, I am very aware, and so should you, of the intrinsic complexity that lies behind using these types of words. So there's another disclaimer. Now, just like there are intrinsic complexity to using these words, like cultural objects and looted art, the same goes to determine how certain objects ended up in museums. What do we mean with unlawful or illicit? Do we argue that something can only be considered looted if it was taken in a way that it broke the law, that it broke the spirit of the law, or if it was taken in times of violence, so colonialism, conflict, instability, war? What we do know, and what I already mentioned, is that colonial times were violent times. And therefore this context, as in during the colonial occupation, can be characterized as a time in which power was entirely unequally distributed. Local customs, cultures, peoples were considered inferior, and already existing societies and an imperial system placed on top of them. So an imperial system of governance. In this context, it is very difficult then, of course, to determine which objects were traded, stolen, looted, forced to be sold. And at the same time, it was not the only thing that was happening. At the same time, we had, for example, scientific explorations and religious missions. So it is therefore not unsurprising that these objects can not only be found in museums, but can also be found in, universities. Which broadens the scope as to where you can encounter these objects. Not to forget to mention, of course, in the hands of private individuals. At the same time, disputes take place for sometimes hundreds of years these Parthenon marbles, which are widely known as the Elgin marbles, but here again we have a problematic terminology, right? Parthenon marbles, were taken by Thomas Bruce from Athens, that was then under rule by the Ottoman Empire, and sold to the British Museum in the early 19th century. Now, some parties actually argue, well, the legal position is clear because there is an idea that there was a transaction, that the Ottoman administration actually gave legal permission for this, and that the subsequent sale of Thomas Bruce to the British Museum was also a legit sale. Other parties argue differently, and they state, well, Athens was under Ottoman rule, which actually makes it highly unethical and problematic to decide that this is then a legitimate sale. At the same time, the marbles were very damaged in trying to make them transportable for their long journey. Since this had not been resolved for over 200 years, or maybe even 250, I'm not so good at counting on the spot, yeah, this still causes diplomatic tensions up until, I think, last year, when there was a fight between Sunak and his Greek counterpart, Mitrokatis. I really hope that I'm saying this correct. So it still causes diplomatic tensions more than 200 years later, and also shows just how complex these discussions actually are. And because of all this, because of this widespread, because of the wide geographical spread in which these objects are, it is very difficult to put a number on it. But it's also always the first question that people ask. How big is this? How many objects are we talking about? Now, I'm always nervous to put a number on it. But in the Netherlands alone, the estimations go into the hundreds of thousands of objects. So you can imagine that in Europe, we are dealing with really a lot of objects that are either from a colonial context or have a colonial context. That is actually how the Colonial Consortium Netherlands usually frames it. Which is, I want to say funny, but I should say an interesting observation as a criminologist. I know there's at least one criminologist in the room. Because rather than being afraid of what maybe can get stolen from a museum, the fear, in my observation, has actually moved much more to what actually do we have in our museums and collections that can be problematic. So one of the most pressing questions for museums nowadays, therefore, is, have the objects in our museums been acquired in a fair and just manner? And I would like to add on that, who determines then also what just and fair is? And in consultation with whom? And one strategy that museums have, and other actors, to answer these questions is provenance research. Now, and if I'm going too fast, please, but I think I'm okay. Now, provenance in its simplest terms refers to research into the ownership history of objects. This means that through a variety of documentation like receipts, gallery catalogs, archaeological publications, auction records, inventories, notary reports, collection databases, private letters, pictures, anything, you name it, that traces back where the object came from, or maybe where it was made, who owned it, etc. Now, it is very normal also for older objects to have gaps in this provenance. If anything, if I would see a 300-year-old object, be it painting, sculpture, I would get suspicious if I would see a step-by-step recollection of every single moment in time of where this object came from, who owned it, where it was. Okay, that would actually make me suspicious. Information can simply be missing due to unavailability of data. Owners, for example, might want to be anonymous for all sorts of reasons. It can even be, for example, that an object was indeed looted, for example, as Nazi loot, returned to its rightful owner or the heirs of the rightful owner, and then they sold or donated it again. At the same time, there are a plethora of objects that never had an owner. This idea of ownership here is also contested. A statue of a Hindu god adorning a temple was never intended to necessarily be owned. So why would there be an owner or a provenance of the first owner in the first place, or maybe even of an artist? So there's a lot of flavors in there. And of course, another flavor is the purposely obscuring this history because you have something unlawful, immoral, or illicit to hide. But very important for us to know is that there are not really any binding or legal guidelines for how to do provenance research or how to do due diligence, which means that you do everything in your power to prevent yourself from committing an offense. Sometimes it can be very obvious. If I would buy a painting from the trunk of a car, okay, I can assume that it might be stolen or pretty sure that it might be fake. Because why would it be sold from a car and not from a dealer, right? There is a licit market for art and a licit market for antiquities. So I would expect this mostly to be able to be bought at the dealership or at an auction or something that we know where this is supposed to be bought. But then, unfortunately, that does not always indicate also that what you're buying or selling is then unproblematic. The background of this slide, for example, lists the provenance of this particular object that was for sale on an art fair as the UK art market. Yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot of UK art markets. There's not really a date or a name attached to it. And we are talking about an object from 19th century India, country that is known to be heavily looted. And now I am not saying that this particular object is looted, is problematic. I did not ask about any more data when I saw this, so I am not saying that this object that this pertains to is a problem. But I want to stress that this type of information provision in one way or another indeed already shows that the legitimization of these types of players as simply being the right space to buy because, well, you can expect that these actors did the provenance research and you can buy it in good faith if it went to all sorts of procedures to assure that it is indeed an unproblematic piece, then, yeah, then you should be able to trust that as a buyer. Now, maybe not always. So it remains important for you, if you ever want to engage in the licit trade in cultural objects, that you ask yourself, when you see ads or sellers of objects, in this case, a sarcophagus bust with unknown origins, that you can buy via an online marketplace and have shipped to your house via DHL. Just going to let that sink. If listing export licenses being present on large art fairs is indeed really meaning that it is not problematic to sell, trade, or acquire objects. But like I said, there are no real binding legal guidelines or agreements on how to do this type of provenance research. And at the same time, of course, colonial loot suffers from the fact that legislation was not always in place to prevent this at the time, or was enacted at that time. Therefore, in today's time, dealing through a legal framework for looting during colonial times is complicated, to say the very least. And many therefore argue, which is a discourse that has gotten more and more traction in the 21st century, is to move away from sort of a discussion on legal structures to a discussion on these objects based on moral ethical considerations. That this is also complex shows a 2021 auction by Christie's titled Quetzalcoatl, Serpent à Plume, or Feathered Snake. So, I need to catch my breath. In February 2021, we're in recent times, Mexico's National Institute for Anthropology and History, which is obviously translated, filed a complaint with the Mexican Attorney General's office requesting state support to recover objects in some of the 39 lots that were sold at a Christie's sale titled Quetzalcoatl. Now, according to Diego Prieto, I'm sorry, that's probably terribly pronounced, the then director of the institute in a press conference argued that 30 objects, and I quote and translate, and I'm reading now, seem to meet conditions to prove their belonging to the original peoples of our territory that flourished before the arrival of European cultures. And again, I quote, and that the archaeological assets of our country are the property of the nation and are beyond any act of commerce. He dropped another small bomb by arguing that the mask that is displayed here on the top right was actually a fake, or at least a modern fabrication of what was sold as an original Teotihuacan mask. Christie's on their end argued that, well, as there's no evidence that would challenge the lawfulness of the sale would continue. And it did. And actually the majority of the pieces did get sold, either well within or above the estimated sale price, even the mask. Now, this illustrates two different perspectives on how looking at looted art can play out at one another. One perspective takes a bit of a rigid legal approach by arguing that, yeah, nothing unlawful can be proven, so then nothing unlawful can be proven, so it must be lawful. Whereas another takes a bit of a double perspective, Because on the one hand, Mexico has had heritage laws for, I believe, as early as 1820, 1821, like pretty much right after it established itself as being Mexico. Which means there is a legal framework that prevents objects from being inalienable, as it is with a fancy word, right? They cannot just leave the country without an export license. So on the one hand, there is a legal framework. On the other hand, he also talks about a more heritage-minded. He takes a more heritage-minded approach, that these objects are not simply owned or should be owned by an individual, but that they belong to a nation, and that they belong to the peoples, the original peoples actually, of that nation. Because great the nation state, but it belongs to the original people that flourished before the Europeans came. That is in his words. There's something to say about the latter and about the rights of indigenous people and whatnot, but there's two perspectives here that contradict one another. And that taps into something else. And some of my students actually saw this, that I see also now here. I'm really happy that you remained interested in, and this was the end of the presentation also. Yes. So Quetzalcoatl is big in Mexico, needless to say. And these are all three. The one on the right is a bit difficult to see, but it's a temple in Teotihuacan. And on top of this, on the sides, there's a bunch of images of Quetzalcoatl. Okay, so this feathered serpent. All three, they're not identical, but they're the same thing, effectively. They're the same representation. They're the same object, one could say. However, the one on the left, I took a picture of at an art fair. So this was for sale. I could touch it, which I did, and that was very weird. That is a very weird experience when your entire life you were told that you cannot touch things in sort of, museums, and you look with my mother, who has told me my entire life, you look with your eyes, not with your hands. Well, not my entire life, until I was 6 years old at least. But okay, you cannot, but it's for sale, it's commerce, it's property. I could have had this Quetzalcoatl in my living room. No, I mean I couldn't, because no way I was able to afford it, nor should I morally do that also, hey, but okay, technically it was for sale. The second one I saw, it's not my picture, but from the archive of the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico. I saw it there. It's a museum object. It has 20 signs that say do not touch. And on the right, of course, it is a part of a cultural heritage site. So it's a temple. You can also not touch it, but it's sort of, let's say, in its original context. It is, these are heavily refurbished and okay, but the essence is that they are in their original context, in their original state. So you have commerce, cultural object, and how God intended it, let's say, to be. And you see that even though we are talking about three the same objects, maybe not identical, but we're talking about the three exact same type of object, they have a completely different meaning and a completely different connotation and different, well, supposedly different values, but actually not. They actually all have the same intrinsic and the same intangible importance for people. The fact that you can buy the one and not the other, and the fact that you cannot touch the one and that the other doesn't make it actually any different. But we classify these now as different things. So yeah, think about that the next time you don't start touching things in museums. That is not actually also the point of this presentation, but those are things to think about. We unconsciously have these connotations to these objects because we, and I say we here, as in Western Europe, have learned to look at these objects in this way. However, not all looting took place in colonial times, as I already mentioned, and I am already moving a little bit towards the non-colonial times. It continues until today, but many authors do argue that it follows a certain sort of post-colonial logic or a post-colonial structure, where objects tend to move from origin countries through transit countries into destination countries. It has also been referred to as source transit market, and it usually shows a flow of objects that go from countries in the global south, so-called global south, via transit locations, often in the same region, to market countries that are then often in Europe and the United States. And if we would want to make a statement on what the common organizational criminal structure then is, then we can talk about a market supply chain that contains a network of looters, intermediaries, dealers, and collectors. At the same time, because I know there's a criminologist here, so I need to be careful, there's also not one way in which the trafficking of cultural objects is organized, okay? Looting and trafficking is, for example, rampant in countries that are unstable due to conflicts such as war and economic crises. We have seen this, and we are seeing this, for example, in Syria, Afghanistan, but also in Ukraine. At the same time, like the Turquoise Skull that you see here on the right, which is in the World Museum in Leiden, it can be the work of someone suspected to have been so intrigued by the excavation of a tomb and a subsequent public interest that they themselves decided to fabricate a skull and mosaic, glue them together, and sell them as cultural property. So, is there one particular flavor? No, it can take many forms. But again, like I said, I am trying to give you nuance in being more general, in one way or another. So generally saying again, it is very difficult to visualize data about this or to know exactly how these flows go or how many objects are trafficked. You can definitely follow this, of course, on a case-by-case basis. You can technically follow objects through criminal networks, which makes me a hyper-traditional criminologist to look at it like that. Technically, you can follow objects. You can retrace these steps, but giving general hotspots or providing maps is difficult. Now, Memoria Robada, which is a project of Ojo Publico, an investigative journalism platform from Peru, aim to do this, though, by triangulating and comparing data from auction sales, repatriation, and the International Police Organization Stolen Works of Art database, which is really a fantastic website. It's at the top right. This is going to be recorded and the slides then also available, so you can find this. I urge you to please look at this, because it is a fantastic amount of intelligence, and if anything also just very fun, because they have interactive data. You can see how trafficking and how thefts went and what got returned. However, unfortunately, due to Interpol's data in there, it is rather skewed towards theft taking place in Europe. Not because there are more thefts in Europe, or that countries in Latin America are not able or interested in reporting these thefts. It has to do with the very opaque nature of looting. It obscures criminal activity by definition. And if you look at Interpol, you will actually also see that categories of antiquities and archaeological objects are far less represented than those paintings, those things that have a maker and that can be easier documented and registered. It makes sense. If you do not know that crime happened, you cannot report it. In criminology, we call this a dark figure. So crimes that happen, but they are not reported or registered with the local or with the correct authorities. And then it didn't happen. I mean, of course it did happen, it just did not get registered. So it's a dark figure. We're in the Netherlands, we all have bicycles. A lot of people don't report their bicycles stolen, which means that the official registered number of bicycles with the police is far lower than the number of bikes that are actually stolen. And that's the dark figure. Now, in looting, it's a bit more complicated than a bicycle. I'm going to show you, I'm going to tell you why. There's 3 things that make this particularly difficult. First of all, these types of objects are looted, dug up, or in any way illegally acquired from a place that might be undocumented. And one example is the stele on this slide. In the 1960s, several of these objects surfaced on the art market, and despite the fact that archaeologists could determine that it had to be from Guatemala's Petén region, it was unclear to which exact site it belonged. Simply because, and I say this in the biggest air quotes, the site was not discovered yet. Of course it was just that looters found it before they were documented or registered by any public authority or by archaeologists or by whatnot. So then effectively, these objects, they never existed. I mean, they exist, they are right there, they're in front of us, not on paper. So the origins are heavily obscured, and once they arrive on the art market, this was in the US, they already passed through several hands. So of course there was someone or someones who dug them up and transported them and sold them, but this not only renders provenance research or the history complicated, but also, the trafficking routes, because we only see them once they resurface in a market. Problem 2. a lot of heritage sites that are known and that are actually documented or registered are also prone to looting, simply because it's impossible to just implement external oversight in every single one of these sites. If you have thousands of heritage sites, which is a low estimate for a lot of archaeologically rich countries, like, gosh, Belize, for example, then it is impossible to put, let's say for the fun of it, a security guard in every single site. So lack of external intervention and lack of external oversight is a big problem. And 3, the current market is already saturated with a lot of these illicit material, right? Remember this colonial times and also looting that took place in post-colonial context. So there's a lot of circulation of these objects already taken place, and most likely they will be taking place. Some of them are in private hands, they might enter the market or vice versa. So as a summary, we are dealing with sometimes remote, difficult to access locations in which sites and objects are not documented or registered, or lack external oversight. And I'm not saying lacking in the sense that someone is at the wrong here. I'm saying in the sense that it is virtually impossible or difficult to do that. But yeah, not for criminals, or not for people who want to perhaps, or at times can therefore undisturbingly loot and traffic. Of course, at the same time, there's a market demand for this, and that keeps also these materials in circulation. Now, illicit trafficking, and this is one of the more infuriating comments, is often discussed as a national or regional responsibility. However, it has, of course, a transnational nature, almost per definition. Another comment that is often heard is that source countries, so these countries in the global south, they do not take measures to protect cultural heritage, or they do not have any legal provisions, or that they simply do not care. Now, that's, of course, not an argument that I like. It's also not true. In case of Latin America, like I said, where I focus on, and this goes for a lot of the countries in this continent, many of the states can claim blanket ownership of cultural heritage. And some, like I said, like Mexico, from as early on as the 1820s. 18, that's 1 and 8. It's important to say. This is where you can see this a little bit. You can also see that there's a big difference between countries, right? Some implemented earlier, some later. Doesn't therefore necessarily mean, or it doesn't mean that before this time it was therefore okay to loot and plunder, just because maybe there was no law. Also doesn't mean that there was no involuntary loss or forced dispossession of cultural objects. Because we all know, just because also there is law doesn't mean that the crime does not occur. So what are the problems then? Now, I again have to go back to this idea of terminology and problems with terminology. Often you will see in legal provisions, you will see the term cultural property. And with property, the focus lies immediately quite heavily on ownership and who can be considered as the legal owner. And I urge you all to read the book, this one, by Evelien Kampfens, who explains this in far greater detail than I ever am, because I am just really not a lawyer. And I'm leaning heavily on her for these slides. However, when there is an ownership dispute regarding an object, like the Christie's one, for example, these disputes, are regulated by the legislation of the country where the object is located at the time that the transaction or a purchase takes place. What that means is that the law of the state in whose territory the item is located governs the property law regime with regards to that particular item. Why this poses an issue is because if you then have an object that was trafficked or was moved from source to transit and ownership was transferred because this object was considered to be bought in good faith, someone bought it in good faith, they didn't know, or simply because time passes long enough, the statute of limitation, you effectively have just laundered an object. So not money, but you laundered an object. At the same time, this invites issue 2. Foreign public law, like these heritage laws in Latin America, will not generally be applied in a different jurisdiction. However, at the same time, these are the laws that actually make this trafficking act to be unlawful, or that you transfer them without a license as unlawful. Now, the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects actually addresses this, particularly that the law of the source country should determine the unlawfulness of the transfer, including a compensation for the buyer, should they have extensively performed this due diligence. which would sound like a great solution. But unfortunately, many market countries did not sign this convention because, well, it hurts in the ownership. Now, I don't have time at all to go into depth on all the legal provisions that exist in terms of conventions and multilateral agreements and as such, but know that there is something. Often people say there's no legal provisions or no legal frameworks. No, they are there. It's just a complicated, swamp-like maze, and many conventions require signatories, which require implementation into national laws that can conflict and contradict with one another. So it is there, but it is a bit of a minefield. Now, some of the most well-known I have listed here. For example, the 1954 Hague Convention, which just celebrated its birthday, was particularly designed for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. The UNIDROIT, like I just mentioned, facilitate the restitution and return of cultural objects, that the source country's legislation should be the one that should be at the forefront. But the UNESCO 1970 Convention might be the most well-known, fully titled the United Nations Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. Now, this convention served three purposes effectively. One, to pressure art-rich countries, to undertake measures to create an accurate inventory of their public collections and to create protocols for export. Two, to compel countries that are in possession of cultural objects to return them. So, yeah, what do people consider important or not? This is also in big air quotes. And it's not to the nature of the objects or the artifact or the site, but a result in negotiation. So again, this is not necessarily also in a horizontal or a power equal sense, but also on an unlevel, unbalanced playing field. But to give you an example of what these authors are talking about, what you see here is a truly epic picture, simply because it was taken somewhere between 1890 and 1899. That is just, when you have these old pictures, they make me want to just crawl into them because they're pretty impressive. This is a picture taken in Araucanía, which is now a region in Chile, which are called Che Mamul, and you see them here. So these big statues. And Che means people, and Mamul means wood in the Mapudungun language, which is spoken by the Mapuche people, which are indigenous to what is now Chile and Argentina. And these statues could be up to 4 meters tall, made of wood, and effectively stood over a person's, stood within person's funerary rites. So when someone passed, and were subsequently erected over the grave of a deceased person. So in one way or another, we can say that this is some form of what we might know as a gravestone. They were also made in the resemblance of the deceased, and the idea in the broader sense of the word was that not only could they use these statues in order to contact their ancestors, but also for themselves to become an ancestor and in supporting their soul from reaching the Mapuche version, let's say, of the hereafter or heaven. But like I said, it's not the same principle, but you get it. Land above, I think they call it. So needless to say, this is a rather fundamental part of Mapuche life, and I don't think there's a Mapuche person that would say that this is not important because, of all the reasons that I said. However, when I ask you if this is cultural heritage after the 40 minutes that I've now been talking, maybe because now you say no. Maybe not, actually, because maybe this is a custom of a certain people. Maybe this should not be in a museum. But then if you go to the Pre-Columbian Museum, which is called Pre-Columbian Museum, in Santiago, in Chile, then maybe you think yes, because they are also there. And of course, the very most important thing is, the communities and the individuals that actually belong to this culture. What do they think? Who can decide, and it's just like not me, for themselves what is important and if this is relevant and if it is problematic. So this is a picture, not mine, I wish, where not the same as that you saw now. These are slightly shorter, but these are where some of them are now, and where also pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial times sort of intertwine. Because as you can imagine, these Che Mamuls were considered by the Spanish, right? The Mapuche were there well before the Spanish. They considered this heresy, how do you say it? Heresy? Blasphemic? So they were used as firewood, they were destroyed, they were also sold, of course, because why not? And at the same time, of course, they also ended up in museums. Complex matter, and I'm definitely not saying that these particular statues are looted or stolen, or that the Pre-Columbian Museum is in the wrong, actually on the contrary, but it is simply to exemplify the context or the perceptions of the museum use of the Cemamul, and that they are actually also diverse and heterogeneous. Multiplicity of meaning. As in the sense that its current socio-political, as well as its current socio-cultural significance. So important here to note also, and in the spirit of Laura Jane Smith also, the meaning of the Cemamul is not inherently as material objects, but it should be understood as a subject that has not lost its attribute despite the fact that it is used within a museum, just like those 3 Quetzalcoatls that I showed you. At the same time, some also argue that the use of these Cemamul can also be considered as a strategy of cultural revitalization and socio-political vindication in those spaces where they are inserted, in this case in a museum. The diversity of opinions and reflections that are expressed creates then at the same time a proposal for the conservation, exhibition and respectful display of the Cemamul. So it is not black and white, these discussions. It's a nuanced discussion. Because if museums have the power to legitimize forms of culture as being more important than others, then yes, put these Cemamul that might not have a place in a museum, right, because they were gravestones, put them in a museum and revitalize this and give more agency and make the Mapuche culture just as important. Because that power of that museum works also in that way, if that makes sense. So important here, or perhaps the most important in any way forward, which is really a question that I hope I do not get, how to move forward, but is community engagement and voices and agency of communities who it also concerns. So these, if you see how difficult it is simply to determine what is heritage, or not simply to determine, but to determine what is heritage, what is important, what are the qualities, intrinsic and material, etc., etc., etc. Now yeah, hey, good luck in arguing what is then, you know, to return, or what is important, or what is not, right? We talked about the word loot and art and unlawful and illicit, but then the whole concept of heritage as a discursive logic makes it extremely complex to ask then who it belongs to, what uses it has, does it belong to one owner or not? And these are questions that people are definitely attempting to answer, and most particularly in the field of critical heritage study. But how does this relate to looted art, right? Because that's, if we remember, we were talking about that. Now yeah, this makes it just much more difficult, because this diversity and opinions and reflections also pertain to then when we settle disputes about loot outside of court, which is what happens a lot. And a difficulty with national collections, and this universal and national collection, national museum, is that whenever a request for restitution is made, this request is usually then made to the state, because we have a nation state that is responsible for these national museums, national collections. And not always is that very easy, because what if you indeed have an object that belongs to a community that is marginalized within that particular state, or that perhaps that object or that artifact belongs to a community that historically been marginalized, doesn't feel represented by that particular state. It's great, you're going to request, for example, the return of an object, and then it goes to a state that, yeah, you don't feel represents your needs. Not saying that this is the example, but an example of this is this particular Moai statue. It was repatriated actually in 2022 from the mainland of Chile to Rapa Nui, which is the name for Easter Island. And Rapa Nui it's very far from Chile actually, it's really a few hours flight. It's quite far, but it was annexed already in the late 19th century, but let's say 15 or 20 years before, I don't have the dates now exactly, this particular Moai, this statue, was already taken from the island by a Chilean ship took it from Rapa Nui, placed it in the National Natural History Museum. And it was returned to the people of the island in 2022, which I think was also the first time that this actually happened in Chile, but won't pin me on that. But important here is to understand that Rapa Nui, although they are now formally part of the Chilean nation state and have Chilean passports, and maybe if you would look at a map and you can say, well, this is Chile, as in the state of Chile, they are their own people with their own identity, customs, cultures, background, and do not necessarily feel Chilean or are for themselves Chile or the nation state that is Chile. Like I said, they were annexed by Chile. So that's a bit of a different story. Talk about also imbalances in power. At the same time, this return also exemplifies again the fact that this is not merely an object, but actually it was the intrinsic values that perhaps, and I do not like this word, to the Western eye, are not understood. So this was an ancestor, considered an ancestor, and in part of a repatriation program, which translates to give us back the mana of our ancestors, which is a grassroots initiative that seeks to restore these Rapa Nui ancestors and heritage, was what happened, was what underlined the case here. Lost my wording a bit there. So it was returned not necessarily under a legal provision, because it's in the same, again, effectively by law in the same country, right? It is the same country, so you don't really, it was returned within the country, but to a different community, under the presence or the pretense of the sense that this was an ancestor, and that this had spiritual and religious and important meaning to the people of Rapa Nui. So that's not a legal argument, that is a moral ethical argument. But it did return in 2022. And what I want to say is that what returned was an ancestor and not a statue. Even though I keep saying it's a statue because I can't help myself. But that is what happened, and that is how we should look at this. But also this was settled outside of court. Took 150 years though, but you have something. There's hope for maybe the Parthenon Marbles. I'm getting to the end, okay? It's not all doom and gloom. I want to end on a positive note, because we are also seeing more and more of these narratives happening or coming up in the museum field. More and more initiatives are taking place within museums, institutions with collections, and all sorts of other cultural organizations that aim to decolonize, in the broadest sense of the word, their institutions, or at least attempt to account for colonial legacies that pertain to many of the museum's collections and histories, as I started my presentation with. And more initiatives are also emerging to correct or try to correct part of past wrongdoings, and it might not always go fast enough. And what constitutes decolonization should, according to me and actually many other authors, not simply be about return, but also about reparation. But nevertheless, we're seeing in the last 10 years an increase in discussions, an increase in debates on the issues that I spoke about today. And what I really hope that you take away from this presentation is that you also now have perhaps a more nuanced perspective, and perhaps you in the future will also become these people that are going to try to answer these questions in these museums, right? Can you make a statement, can you make a comment, or can you help museums by providing a nuanced perspective and perhaps a not so traditional perspective that focuses on objects but more on the intrinsic values of heritage. And one final thing that this is a lot, this is a mess, I know that, but there's a lot of academics' work that I leaned on, my own work. There's a lot of people who work on this. It is really not only me. There's lots of grassroots initiatives. There are a lot of people who are doing a lot of great work without getting paid for it, or getting paid for it very little. So I do want to urge you to again, this is going to be online, so you can see this later, but to check out some of these resources of people that are doing a lot of work, and also that I used a lot for making this presentation for you today. So please, a lot of these actually, they do deserve your attention. And that was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering some questions.